Welcome back to Group Therapy. I'm one of your hosts, licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Kristen Casey.
And I am licensed clinical social worker, Kristen Gingrich.
And I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. Jessica Rabon.
This month is National Suicide Awareness Month, so we are talking all about the very stigmatized and important topic of suicide. I wanted to take this time to offer a trigger warning. We're going to be talking openly about suicide. We're not going into major details, but we're going to be talking about it. So if you have to pause the episode at any time and come back later, feel free to do so because this episode can be heavy for some. And just want to let you guys know that we will provide resources if you or anybody that you know is struggling with suicidal ideation towards the end of the podcast. And those will be linked in the show notes as well. So settle in, take a seat, and welcome to Group Therapy. Last week, we talked all about grief, and we asked you what is one way you can come alongside someone who is going through grief or who has just lost someone. And you said, these were great. You said, I helped my friend clean her room when she was feeling depressed and in deep grief. Oh my God, that's so nice. Awesome. Just be present with them, helping them with whatever they need in the moment. So great too. I really enjoyed when someone brings up good memories and we have a good laugh. That's amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, and then this last one, asking the question, tell me about them, referring to the person who they've lost. How sweet is that? Oh my gosh. So just to start our discussion, I figured we could start with some stats. So KBI and Jess, if you have any stats to offer about suicide rates.
Yeah. I have a lot. The most poignant one is that every 11 minutes in the United States, someone dies by suicide in the United States. And I think, How many is it in the worldwide, Jess?
One every 40 seconds.
40 seconds. Like,
it's so, I don't know. Life could be so fragile. And I think it's always so important to remember, like when people are struggling with suicidal ideation or suicide, it happens more than we might think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think another one I wanted to share is, at least in the United States, we saw in 2018 and 2019 declines in suicide. And then in 2021, we saw an increase in suicide, again, returning to 2018 numbers. So we only have data from 2021 is the most recent data, but in the United States, 48,183 individuals died by suicide. Wow.
You know what I wonder too, if like you said, it decreased and then increased again. I do wonder, like, obviously the pandemic potentially had something to do with that. But I do wonder what the variables were for, before that and how they decreased, maybe access to care, hopefully. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like to look at group differences too. So we know that based on race and ethnicity, there are some groups that have higher rates of suicide than others. So the groups with the highest rates are non-Hispanic American, Indian and Alaska Native people, followed by non-Hispanic white people. And if we're just thinking about groups, so suicide is the 11th leading cause of death for both Hispanic and non-Hispanic people of all races. I thought that was really interesting. And people who are veterans, who live in rural areas, or workers in certain industries and occupations like mining and construction, they have higher than average rates of suicide than typical populations. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual people have a higher prevalence of suicide rates than, people who identify as heterosexual. And in terms of sexual minorities, data from 2020 show that self-reported suicide attempts decreased with age. So overall, based on minority groups, there are people who struggle with suicide a little more than other people. So I think that's always important to note. So just want to open it up. Just as therapists, like, what do we think about suicide in general and, just treatments and stuff like that?
It is something that we need to talk more openly about, but it is really hard to talk openly about. Because prevention starts with talking about it. But the problem is that there's so much stigma, so much shame associated with it that people don't want to. And a lot of times individuals who are struggling with that already feel so alone. So the idea that someone is actually going to listen to it and listen to them, like they don't believe that.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, KBI. And I think, it is a hard topic to talk about. And there are so many misconceptions. And, K10, I know you said, like, as therapists, what do you think about it? And I think if we, the people in the mental health field, don't even want to talk about it, then why would like average people that aren't in the mental health field that may be struggling, maybe not struggling, want to talk about it? And I don't know about you all, but, when I reflect back on my training in graduate school, like, yes, we are taught how to do like a suicide risk assessment, but I feel like even training in treating suicidality, like next steps, things like that, is not as great as it could be, which is why you hear all those horror stories from people that are like, I mentioned to my therapist that I had suicidal ideation and then I was sent to an inpatient unit, because I feel like a lot of therapists aren't even comfortable with treating, because it is like their client's life is in their hands, which then feeds into the stigma and makes people not want to talk about it. And it's this horrible cycle.
Yeah. I mean, I think that education is key. I think it's one of the hardest parts about being a therapist. And this is, and when I talk about this on my lives, because I get this a lot, is at the end of the day, it is our job to keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I always say I can only speak for myself, but that looks like a lot of different things. At the end of the day, it could be what we call here in Maine, we call it a blue paper. I think it's called a 5150 in other states.
It's white papers in South Carolina.
Yeah, that involuntary hold. I can tell you that as therapists, we don't enjoy doing that. Mm-hmm. And it's that fear, for therapists, sometimes it's that fear of liability. That if you were to leave my office and something were to happen, my license could be on the line in that capacity. But the problem is then when you lace that with lack of education, lack of knowledge of just how to ask the questions and create a plan, not this safety contract, which we'll probably get into, but just like a plan of conversation with your clients. Every single client who's come to me and I haven't had to take those next steps, we have left session with a plan, not a safety contract, not like you're not going to go do this because then I'm going to stop seeing, like that type of stuff, but a solid plan on how to move forward and move through. Because I also asked all the underlining questions to figure out those and to answer those questions of plan, means, and intent, which are those big three that as therapists we really look for.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm so happy you mentioned it, because if I'm just being really honest, when I was a really green therapist, if I think back, and if somebody, one of my clients mentioned like anything about suicide, I would like immediately tense up and I'd be like, oh my gosh, what do I do? What do I do? Like it was almost like a freak out moment when you're under supervision, and then you call your supervisor like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And normally it's like, we're allowed to talk about suicide in session without having to put somebody inpatient. That's okay.
Yeah.
Inpatient is usually like most of the time the last intervention that we would use if there's no other means possible. And I always like to really drive that home. And I don't know about you guys, but if my client starts to talk about suicide and they feel a little hesitant, I always say, let's revisit confidentiality. Let's revisit the exact way in which you would go inpatient. And I get really detailed about it, because the more that we talk about suicide, the better. And it doesn't mean that people are going to complete suicide the more that we talk about it. I think that's a big misconception too, which is why I'm really glad we're talking about it too.
Absolutely. I love that you brought that up, K10, about like revisiting confidentiality, because at my intake session with clients, when I go over limits of confidentiality and we talk about like harm to self or others, I always say, I don't want you to be fearful that if you disclose that you're having thoughts of hurting yourself, that it's going to result in an inpatient stay. And I go over it then, like what it would look like if someone were to disclose those thoughts, because I say, like, I cannot help you with those thoughts if I do not know you're having them. And I don't want you to fear being sent inpatient. So then you don't disclose them, and then I can't help you. So then you're struggling on your own. And I also understand why people fear that. Like in the past, probably week or 2 weeks, I've had, like, I asked that question of, all my patients, and I've had 2 people say, like, if I answer yes, what are you going to do? Or like, what are the next steps? And so then it opens a conversation, because I think there is this misconception, like you said, if we talk about it, more people are going to do it. But also if you talk about it with your therapist, people are going to automatically white paper you in South Carolina, blue paper, involuntary commit you.
Well, and I think having those conversations helps that therapeutic alliance. Like I've had clients go into conversations and I'll say, I'm going to stop you, not because I don't want to listen, but kind of like K10, because I want to revisit where the things that you're telling me, I want to revisit these things because I don't want to trick you. I don't want to feel like you've been gotten, because that's not my goal here. Is to like, oh, let's get him to talk super in detail, and then I'm going to, bam, put him in the hospital. Yeah. That's not my goal. Now, I always tell my clients, I want you to be honest with me, because at the end of the day, I always tell them, if the hospital is where you need to be, that is where you need to be. But a good chunk of time, 90% of the time, at least the clients that I was seeing, that was not the place that they needed to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, and I always tell my clients, again, specific to me, if I'm going to send you to the hospital, I want it to be a mutual decision. And I want to work with you so that you can also see why it's a mutual decision. Because if I force you there, because I have that power to do so, that's not going to help our relationship at all. You're probably not going to come back. So let's collaborate and have those conversations and get into the sticky nitty gritty. But even then, like as the person who's experiencing, and so as someone who has experienced suicidal ideation and significant in the last several years, it is also really hard to just talk about it with yourself and being honest with yourself and opening that door, because the reality is when you open that door, you've now made it a reality. When the when the inside thoughts become outside words, it makes it real.
Yeah. And that could be scary because, like you said, like if you feel like you don't have that level of trust with your therapist, or they're not actually informing you, in my mind, this is part of the ongoing informed consent procedure of like knowing exactly what can happen, before you continue to say anything. Because it's the client's right to be able to disclose or not disclose whatever they want. Although we want them to be honest with us, I think it's really important for them to be well informed. And most of the time, most of the time when I talk to clients about these things, they just want their pain to go away. They don't really want to end their life. They want to end their problems. And I think it's two completely different things at that point, and it's so important to talk about it out loud, but I understand the fear. You just don't know how it's going to shake out. And like Jess said, there are plenty of people out there who have had really bad experiences with therapists saying like, you got to go right inpatient when there was really no plan, means, or even intent, like to the point where you would actually need that,
Absolutely.
So. Well, and that's the biggest thing is like when you're living with those thoughts every day, like I have the education to be able to suss out what my thoughts are. So a lot of times my thoughts weren't as heavy because I knew about them. But for a lot of people, for example, don't know the difference between active suicidal ideation and passive suicidal ideation, and how those two things are very different when they come to, for example, going to the hospital, or how your therapist can react. I've had clients come in and they've been like, yeah, I just didn't want to wake up this morning, but I was scared to tell you because I don't want to go to the hospital. No, like you said, K10, no plan, no means, no intent, just having a bad day. But they thought because they thought that way, it was an automatic hospital stay. When that's not, again, the reality.
It could be more damaging too, like you said, like because then it reduces the trust, and then they're kind of like in this place where they don't technically need to be. I mean, that's not really the clinical intervention for passive suicidal ideation. I mean, you know what I mean? So it's hard.
Yeah. And kind of just to go off of that for any group members that maybe don't know the difference. So passive suicidal ideation, like KBI just said, I didn't want to wake up this morning, or like kind of, I think of like an indifference of, I wouldn't care if I was alive or dead. I usually also think of it as maybe more fleeting thoughts of not wanting to be here, not wanting to be alive. Where active is more, I want to die. You're starting to thinking about, this is how I'm going to do it. I have the means, intent. And, we've already really talked about this, but like plan, mean, intent. And do you have access to means? Is there a time? Like all of those things, that's when it starts getting into active level. And I even think of passive versus active on a spectrum too, because you can have active suicidal thoughts of like, I want to die and this is how I would do it, but you don't have means, and you don't have intent of when you would do it. So it's more like, okay, I'm thinking about these options. Yes, that is now getting into more severe territory than maybe I just didn't want to wake up this morning. But it is like a spectrum, like pretty much everything in mental health. Suicidality is a spectrum. And as clinicians, we assess for that spectrum, assess for your safety, assess for protective factors, coping skills, all of that, to make the best decision for you and your safety.
Yeah. And go ahead, Kristen.
No, you go.
I want to get your guys' thoughts on this too. So even if a client has active suicidal ideation with means, plan, and intent, all three, and they voice this to you and they say, I actually need help constructing a plan to not actually follow through on this. That could be an active conversation in therapy. It's not just like, oh, call 911, you're done. Like that's at least in my experience. It's let's talk about it. Let's come up with an idea, a plan, and then the plan might obviously need more resources. You need more people involved and stuff like that. But it doesn't always mean when you have active suicidal ideation that it's always an inpatient hospitalization. It could be a different sort of plan too. So I always like to make that distinction.
Oh, absolutely. I can think of times where I've had patients come in and have an active plan at the beginning of session. We spend all session, talking about coping skills, things like that. Obviously, I work with children and teens, bring a parent in, and by the end of the session, that active suicidality is no longer active.
Right.
And I think it's important, that you can vacillate between the two, frequently. But it's all about being able to have that conversation. But absolutely. I do want to shift the conversation really quick, because we're spending a lot of time talking about like the therapist perspective, but I know a lot of our group members aren't therapists. And so one of the things I have a question for them is, how do I notice it in other people? Like, what are the signs that someone might be struggling with suicide or might be on the verge of making an attempt?
Yeah, that's so important, because I think knowing those warning signs, not only can you potentially help a friend, but even if you're experiencing it yourself, you know when to intervene for yourself too, and like reach out for resources. One big one that I notice, if I just look at my friend group, I'm taking my therapist hat off. If I look at my friend group and I have a friend that's saying like, they're really apathetic, they're not leaving the house, it's usually a cluster of things and verbalizing things like, oh, I'm not really going to be around for that. Like little things like that. I start to kind of take tune and I'm like, ooh, okay, let me maybe reach out, or maybe let me make note of that. But those are the big things that I might notice. What about you guys?
One of the common things is talking about death, even in a humorous aspect. Trust me, when I am in a bad space and I'm having those thoughts, I am the first to make a joke. It's just in my personality. It's how I cope. But a lot of my friends will notice and they'll say, Kristen, you're making one too many jokes. You okay? And I'm like, no, actually, I'm not. Another piece is pretty common that I see is they begin to make plans for their things, or they start giving away their items.
Yeah.
or adults. And again, this is when I say this, it's coupled with a lot of other symptoms, but you start talking about end of life plans. Maybe they randomly made a will. Now, granted, as an adult, it's really good to have a will.
Yeah.
But like, again, when you couple it maybe with some behavior changes, maybe they are seeming more apathetic. They're making more conversations about death or dying, things like that. And then they're suddenly making a will and they're talking about how you're going to execute this will. Those can be some big signs, at least for adults as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And KBI, you kind of touch on this, but like changes in behaviors. So like we might see like increased risk behaviors, like more alcohol or drug use, reckless driving is another one, or just like taking risks, sleep changes. Another thing I always like to emphasize when it comes to like suicide, especially with relation to somebody that's been depressed, if you have a loved one that has been severely depressed and they're on the upswing of their depression, so they're actually coming out of it and doing it more, that is the time you need to be watching them for suicidal attempts. So the research does show that that is the most likely time someone will make an attempt or complete suicide, because they finally have the energy to do it. And a lot of people, that's counterintuitive, because they're like, oh, you know, my loved one is getting better. They're going out more and things like that. But just because they're getting better, like still check in on them as well.
And that's also a reminder if someone starts medication. One of the things that, is a very interesting side effect of antidepressants is increased suicidal thoughts. And a lot of times that happens because you were so low. And what happens is you're so low, you take a medication, and the point is to bring you high to feel better. But you get into this nasty middle ground where you suddenly have more energy, but you're not feeling better. And so that is also a piece of when you know someone has started a new medication. So partners, parents, if you know that your child or your partner or your friend has started a new medication, it's also really important to ask those questions too when you see that, because it is a very common, I shouldn't even say common. It's not common, but it is a side effect in that because you suddenly have more energy.
Totally. I've seen this on the other end too, because I was an EMT, and a lot of people would say if we responded to suicide attempts, their family would say, "Oh, but they were doing so good." That's usually the first thing they would say. And at the time, I wasn't a psychologist; I didn't know these things, and I'm like, "Oh, that's so interesting. That's so weird." But based on the research, like y'all are talking about, it makes a lot of sense. Once they start going out and doing things, and they have the energy, you know.
And that's why, like, a lot of times when those happen, you'll get that question of like, but they were so good. Why? And the reality is they were just caught in that middle ground.
Yeah. I also think it's important, like we just listed a lot of like warning signs or signs that a loved one may be struggling. But I think it's also important to know some of like the risk factors of the suicide. And because like, yes, people can say like, oh, you know, if you're depressed, you're at higher risk, or like have a diagnosable mental health condition. But we also know things like medical illnesses, like chronic pain, have huge
it's a big one.
Rates of suicide. Or, you know, we talked about behavior changes, but also just like life changes, like job loss, a, you know, big shift in finances, working with kids and teens, bullying is a huge one that I see a lot. I didn't know if you all had any other thoughts on kind of like risk factors.
I know we talked about last week, right? We talked about grief and loss. That is a risk factor when you experience a loss. It is a risk factor. Now, I want to preface that by saying that when someone dies by suicide, it can cause a ripple effect, but that ripple effect probably has already been there. It's causing it. So there's this misconception that like if someone, especially teens, someone dies by suicide, it's going to make other people want to die by suicide. Like it's going to make them want. The reality is it's not going to make something happen that wasn't already there. It just can change the intent behind it. And so I want to kind of put that out there because that is also a very stigmatizing thing that comes from suicide is like that. I remember in high school. So the reason why I'm in the field is because I had a friend die by suicide when I was in high school, and it was a complete shock. It altered me, and I remember the conversations that were had of like, we just don't want any more students doing this. And it was not in like a support, it wasn't like in a we care about our students kind of way. I know that that's where it tried to come from, but looking back and looking at that now, like if I was someone who was struggling, I wasn't speaking up then. When that is the perfect time to speak up. That should we should be creating environments where we can speak about that.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because I think depending on where you're at too, you know, I mean, in school, if you really think about the relationships that you have, everything feels so close knit because it is, you know, so I'm really sorry to hear about your friend, Kristen. That's really hard. And I think too, when I think about community, there's a lot of community risk factors too of like lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to just care in general, discrimination, violence, acculturation stress, like trying to assimilate or acculturate or culturally assimilate, stuff like that, you know. And I think too, like trauma history and even like previous attempts as well, you know, are big risk factors. Obviously, if you've had a client or you have a friend or somebody in your life who's had a previous attempt, it's not to say that they'll always try to do it again, but it's something to be, you know, something to notate.
And
absolutely.
This is, I'm going to say it, but it's controversial. And I want our group members who may disagree with me, I just want you to listen. Firearms in the home are huge risk factors, especially for teens. What I'm saying is I'm not saying to or not to own a gun. What I am going to say is that if you have a gun in your home, you need to be asking these questions consistently. And that firearm needs to be locked up safely. And if someone in your home cannot be safe or they're expressing thoughts, whoever owns that gun needs to have that gun removed from the home. I'm not saying get rid of it. I'm not saying any of that, but to create a safe environment. And that's for anything. If you have a child, if you have a person who comes to you and is like, I'm having thoughts of taking an overdose of medication, you would remove those medications. You would remove sharps. You would remove those things to create safety. Firearms are exactly the same. And even keeping it in a locked safe sometimes isn't enough. Firearms are the leading cause of death in our children right now, and suicide is the second leading cause of death in our under 18. And so I wanted to put that out there as my little soapbox. I know it's controversial. I'm not saying not to own them or to own them. What I'm saying is that we need to be safer about it.
Yeah, you're highlighting the safety of it. Yeah. When I worked at the VA, that would be a conversation we'd have weekly, you know, with my clients about like, where's your firearm? Is it, you know, out of the chamber? I don't know firearms like other people do, especially veterans, right? They're all trained in those things, but we would even provide them with gun locks and stuff like that because the whole point is we want to reduce the steps that you might take, you know, we want to create barriers. That's kind of what you're trying to say, Kristen, of like, I want to create some barriers so that if I am in that headspace and I am in that state of mind and I am in that, like, in that experience in my body, I want to be able to keep myself safe. So I'm with you.
And sometimes if you ask a lot of survivors or people who have tried to make an attempt and did not follow through, they will say there were the barriers. That's what helped. Like I had to go through 3, like I got to the one and it stopped me, but I went through it and I got to the second one. And then suddenly it was like reality slapped me in the face. It slows down that process. And so it is that whole process in that, that we have to be mindful. And that's where it comes in of asking the hard questions. When I have a client who comes in and they're going through something hard and their demeanor has changed, my first question is, have you had thoughts of hurting yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think, KBI, you brought up this topic so well, because I think a lot of people, both therapists and non-therapists, are scared to ask the questions or don't know how to ask them. So you gave a perfect example of, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? You have to be direct, because, saying things like, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? Are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you having thoughts of killing yourself? You're not going to plant the idea in someone's head if they're not having the thought. Exactly. They're not suddenly going to be like, no, I wasn't thinking that, but now that you mention it. But if you ask questions because of your discomfort, like, you weren't thinking of killing yourself, are you? And like, it kind of has like a disapproving tone. Nobody's going to open up to you. And it can be scary. Absolutely. I'm not invalidating that. But, there are so many times that people unintentionally will ask questions in a stigmatizing manner. Yeah. So like saying things like I said, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? Or like, I hate the word crazy, but like, crazy people do that. Like, you're not one of them, are you? Or why would you have those thoughts? Your life is great. Like, things like that. Like, that's not going to help someone want to open up to you. Yeah. So asking those questions directly, compassionately is really important. And anybody can ask.
And being prepared for what the answer might be. They might say no. And then you say, okay, well, I'm here if that changes. Know that I'm here to support you. And if they say yes, what can I do to support you right now?
Yeah.
What can I do to help keep you safe? What can I do? Can I just listen? Can I offer you, here are the resources? Like, I truly believe that everyone should have the crisis number in their phone. Luckily, it's changed to a very simple number, 988. But I truly think that we should have those numbers saved. Or if you are of a specialized group, having the crisis line that directly relates to that group, like the Trevor Project. I know that there are ones for people of color. There are ones for veterans, like saving those in your phone so that you have them.
Totally. And I think for the people out there that who are therapists or friends or family or whoever that feel some level of discomfort with asking, I want you to think about this. Brief moments of discomfort to potentially help somebody's livelihood, I think, is worth it. I think it's always worth it to lean into those things. And when I was a newer therapist, I don't want to go back clinical, but just this is the only reference I have. I would be so scared to ask those things. And then when I think of myself as a young person, because I've had attempts, I wish somebody would have asked me those things back then. I think it would have helped me out so much. It would have showed me that somebody's actually thinking about me, somebody's actually caring about my livelihood or my life. And it's really important to, like Jess said, ask very directly. And with my clients now who even have voiced passive suicidal ideation, every couple of months I'll say, it's a formality of me being your therapist. We're checking in about suicide today. And I literally just put it out there. And I think it's really important to do so.
And I'm going to leave therapist mode for a second. And I'm going to go full Kristen because this is me. Like I've done this with parents who don't want to sit in that uncomfortability. I said, what's going to be more uncomfortable? Asking that question or sitting at your child's funeral?
Oh, that's a deep one. Yeah.
What's going to be more uncomfortable? And and like that again, guys, that is for a specific group of people. And that was not therapist Kristen. I definitely try to word that much nicer, but like, that is the reality. Like we can either sit in the uncomfortability for 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours and sit with that person and ask those hard questions. Or the other option is I could be sitting at their funeral and the rest of my life without them.
Totally.
So what are some things that we can do like to help? Like what are those protective factors that people might have?
First one that comes to mind is, social support. Yeah, literally. It's like in my mind, social support.
I personally believe that it's the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Think about it. Just random example. I was thinking about calling my friend the other day and I'm like, oh, let me just like check in with her, just haven't heard from her in a while. And we were talking on the phone and I could tell she was kind of like trying to get off the phone. And I'm like, no, like what's going on? Like, how are you? And then I was still trying to get her to engage. She was just like really busy and stuff. And she's like, I'm really actually going through a hard time. And if I didn't kind of like reach out to her and we didn't connect, we would have never talked about the hard things. So I think reaching out to your friends, even just to check in, not even to talk about suicide, just to like check in, I think is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think of social support as, the top one, obviously access to care that we can get. I also think of, and this is, I guess, kind of going therapist mode, but anybody can do this, like identifying, who you can reach out to in a crisis, not just people, but like hotline numbers, local resources, things like that. Having coping skills, whatever that looks like for you, is a protective factor, ways to manage and cope with. And then one thing, I don't know if you all do this with your clients as well, identifying reasons for living. So, and I tell people all the time, like, it doesn't have to be this big thing. It can be, I have a lot of clients say they're pets, honestly, but it can be a warm cup of coffee in the morning. Like, that is my reason for living.
We do crisis plans. We do the safety plans at my old job. And one of the questions it says is, what in your life is worth living for? And when they're like, I really don't have anything, I was like, it can literally be anything. If it's a slice of pizza, like shit, cheese pizza is what gets me up in the morning. Like, then that's what it is. And sometimes then they come back with something like a cup of coffee or a piece of cheese pizza or watching Netflix. But, it's something.
Yeah.
It's what is getting you to get out of bed in the morning. And I think just the last kind of preventative is like, if you do have, a therapist or that access to healthcare or medications or things like that, and having that unbiased place where you can go and talk about the hard things if your family isn't supportive or maybe you don't have that. I think that is a huge protective factor as well.
I'm going to be honest, there's no good transition. When it comes to this, because I was going to try to go off of
shorts this week.
Is protective. No. Yes. Yes. So we haven't really talked about, treatments for suicidality yet. We know therapy, we've talked about this on this podcast, CBT, because it's most researched, DBT, psychopharmacotherapies treatments. However, I wanted to pose a question to you all. What other treatments outside of like traditional therapy and medications, like antidepressants, do you think are available for treating suicidality?
Like evidence-based or just in general?
Yes, like interventions, like not that, not ones that we could do necessarily in the community, but more like administered by a therapist or a medical professional.
I feel like, my mind goes therapy, medication, and then my mind also goes to like adjunctive therapies as well, like
goes to DBT.
Like meditation, yoga, stuff like that. But I don't know for sure, actually.
Mine goes to DBT.
Okay.
Oh my God, DBT is a big one. Yeah.
Okay. So this article came out in April 2023, so like hot off the press, looking at different, more novel treatments for suicidality. So the first one we've actually already talked about on the podcast many, many episodes ago, ketamine. So esketamine nasal treatment. So like I said, we've already covered it on the podcast as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, but a couple studies so far have examined this. And I wanted to highlight a study from 2021, because even though this came out in 2023, it was a review of a bunch of different studies that found esketamine plus a comprehensive standard of care, so like DBT therapy, for example, rapidly reduced depressive symptoms in major depressive disorder patients with acute suicidal ideation or behavior compared to a placebo. particularly in those with suicide attempts. So esketamine might be a evidence or a treatment to help with suicidality. Other emerging psychotherapeutic interventions for suicidality include new antidepressants and potentially anti-suicidal glutamatergic. I can't say that. Glutamatergic or GABAergic agents, as well as psychedelics, which we have already covered on our podcast.
Where are the psychedelics?
As well, so like psilocybin. KBI, I'm looking at you for this one. So for other therapies, we have evidence support ECT, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and then transcranial direct current stimulation, so TDCS, which I hadn't heard about. And then there are some other treatments that have been tested in suicide, but don't necessarily have the evidence base yet. So vagus nerve stimulation, magnetic, and triple chronotherapy, which, you know, like I said, have to be further investigated, but it's cool that I think we're expanding. And like we talked about it for our episode on like new and emerging treatments, expanding beyond like the traditional like SSRIs and talk therapy. Any thoughts?
So I can speak to the TMS because, I mean, for anybody who maybe follows me on my account, I've mentioned it on the podcast. I recently completed, I just kicked my death. I recently completed 36 treatments of TMS. So that's transcranial magnetic stimulation. Basically, put a big magnet to my brain, stimulate the mood center, feels like a big old woodpecker, all of that. It worked amazing for me. And I'm still experiencing those effects. But I do remember, you know, they warned me usually week, like treatment 10 to 20 is a really sketchy area because it's stimulating that area. It's giving me the energy. And it was a really scary time for me. I was really struggling. And luckily, again, I have the skills, the support, the therapist. My provider was great. And the benefit of that treatment is I'm seeing that provider every day. And so they're checking in with me and we're doing PHQ-9s and we're doing all of that. But I remember it was about treatment 28. And I realized that I had gone 4 days without a suicidal thought.
Kristen. And
obviously then I had some. And I can tell you right now that since my treatment ended, today is, we're gonna pull the fourth wall. Today is August 29th. On the 31st, it will be a full month since my treatment. I have not had a suicidal thought in 31 days. And
I'm getting like teary eye.
I'm about to bawl my fucking eyes out right now. Jesus. Because I love this bitch so much. You better stay here. Don't you go anywhere.
And how amazing, like, that is to, like, you know, I spent the last, like, 10 years of my life in and out of really bad suicidal ideation that, you know, to go 31 days
so cool.
and not have that, or 30, however many it is, it just feels great. And I think it's also to show, like, yes, I had to do a different treatment, but, like, it does end. You can get treatment that it stops.
I'm sure there was a part of you that was like, when is this going to end? You're probably like, you know what I mean? Like, when am I going to feel okay? You know, and then with this treatment.
Well, and a lot of my thoughts were, I want this to end because I'm tired. Like, we talked about this. Like, I'm tired of feeling this way. I'm tired of this every single day. Now, granted, I had a lot of protective factors that helped me. But it's also to show that it does not discriminate. I am a mental health provider. I have a great job. I have a great life. But I still struggle. It struggled.
Yeah.
Still do in other ways.
Totally.
It's still a hot fucking mess, but
true. That's valid.
Accurate.
If you weren't going to say it, I was going to say it. But
I needed to throw something in there because I love this topic, but this is serious. This is too serious for me sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I think with that treatment, and then I think of like psilocybin, I think of all those things. And I think when I think of psilocybin particularly, I don't know if anybody here has done it, especially in like a therapeutic sense. I would imagine that it kind of expands the focus, because I think with suicide and just thinking about it, we are hyper-focused because it is such a heavy thing. It's like such a deep thing, So I think sometimes we get tunnel vision and our world gets really small and that's all we could see. And I think with therapies like this, especially, what you went through, Kristen, and psilocybin and other things, it kind of like expands it just a tiny bit. Like you could kind of see a little more outside of that tunnel vision. Which makes sense. I mean, with people who are struggling with suicidal ideation, I mean, that's all they really, how could you not think about that if you're experiencing that, So I think it is good to kind of expand the scope and expand the focus. And like with protective factors, that's kind of what it does. It just kind of opens it up a tiny bit until your world starts to get a little bigger again.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You
know what else makes our world bigger?
We're rocking it. Yeah.
The polls.
Let's get her done.
Oh man, guys, I was slacking on the polls this week. It was like 9:00 at night and I was like, oh, I didn't do the polls. So you guys got me in bed doing the polls. So
what?
When I did them.
You were in bed?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay,
go ahead.
You already I've been going to bed at like 1 a.m.
Why? What?
Why not?
True.
Why not?
There's no rules, I guess.
Crazy.
In contrast, I was already in bed asleep by the time KBI posted the polls on Sunday night.
But I was surprised that Jess did not text me at any point through the afternoon to the evening being like, bitch, where are the polls?
I was practicing self-control. I will admit this to you now.
I love
because
that.
I texted the group and then I had texted you separately that morning. And I was like, it was bothering me all afternoon. And I was like, Jess, let go of your control issues. KBI is an adult. She knows what she has to do. You have already sent 2 text messages today. She doesn't need a third.
I probably did need a third.
Well, it was me practicing self-control.
I love that for you.
And not
but I probably
being a
did
control
need the
freak.
third.
Okay, I will now know that I can text you 3 times and remind you of things, but not 4. I mean, I will stop at 3.
Not 4.
You can text me as many times as you want, honey. I will embrace every single one. So let's see. So the first one was: Has your life been impacted? Wow, I can't read suddenly. Have you been impacted in your life by suicide, either personally or known someone who has been? Yes, I have. No, I haven't. Or I'm actually not sure.
I feel like yes, I have is number 1.
Yeah, me too.
Or the most common.
84%.
Oh, wow.
Said yes, I had. And that is, that doesn't surprise me because, right, it's either I had thoughts, someone I know had thoughts, someone I know has had someone in their life who's died by suicide, all of that. Like that's I don't believe that there is anybody who is not impacted in some way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you don't even know that you're impacted, like you don't know if your friend is having thoughts or have had thoughts. So that's how I sit in that. So we did answer this. I did drop this bomb, but someone dies by suicide every 6 minutes, 11 minutes, 17 minutes, or 22 minutes.
11.
Correct answer is 11. I wonder what group members said, though.
I feel like either group member said 6 because I think it's frequent, or 22 because of veteran suicides. And like it's
veteran suicide.
What is the...
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
So it is 11 minutes with 43%.
Oh.
6 minutes said 40. 17 minutes said 11. And 22 minutes was 7%.
Oh, okay.
Wow. Okay. What percentage of Americans believe that suicide is preventable? 23%, 44%, 67%, or 94%.
You gave us this answer before we hit record. I said
I know,
67 when I answered the polls, but I know that's wrong now.
I said 67 as well.
So actually, most people did think it was 67% at 39%. But according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, 94% of people believe that suicide is preventable.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And then I might cry, but we did a little text box and the question was, what's something you would like to say to someone struggling with suicidal thoughts?
Oh,
So
fuck.
again,
I'm just preparing myself.
I'm already crying. It's okay.
Maybe you might need to take a pause. Maybe you really do need these, but it's okay. I know it's hard right now, but one day it'll all be worth it when you see how far you've come. There's a future brighter than what you feel right now. You are worth it. You are lovable. Find a reason to keep going and you're worthwhile. You are not alone. This is for the day you can tell someone about this. I see your pain. It's real. And I want you to know that you matter so much. Keep fighting for the day. I'm glad you're here. I'm here to listen. The hurt and pain is so raw and real. And also remember that the hopelessness is lying to you. We can get through this moment together. You're not alone, even though it feels like it. Wait.
I like that one.
Me too.
That sounds like a lot to carry. Please stay. You are loved and you deserve to see your future unfold. Life won't always be this way. And breathe. Take a minute at a time. I think
So sweet.
I wanted to end on that last one because I truly do think that sometimes when it comes to suicide prevention and getting through that, like sometimes we have to break it down. Like I'm just going to get through this next minute. I am just going to get through this next 20 seconds. I am just going to do that. Like instead of saying, I'm going to make it until I'm 80, I'm just going to make it through this next minute. And again, we talk about the barriers. When we create those barriers, it gives us the time for sometimes that executive functioning to kick back on.
So true. Love it. Oh my God, it's so sweet. You know what else I really love?
Our group member questions.
I didn't know how to transition it, y'all. This is a tough topic. Okay. All right. So as you know, we take your questions every week. We had 51 questions this week. Wow. So what I did was I chose a couple at random, put them at the top, and then we're just going to go from there. But there was one, ironically, that came up first, and it wasn't a question, but I wanted to put it out there. Anonymous said, not so much a question, but a thank you. This episode will drop on the year of my last attempt. I can't believe I made it. Never thought I would see me at this point. Thank you for doing your parts, none of which are small parts. Your work is huge in helping bring light to the darkest times of so many. Still have a long way to go, but I could finally see the hope. So that was a great one to start with. How sweet. So Anonymous, thank you. And I'm really happy that you're here, whoever you are, wherever you are. Hopefully you're not in Ohio with Justin because he's not here today. We know he loves Ohio, just to lighten it a bit. Anyways, next one. Christy from Florida. Has anyone heard of someone simply coexisting with frequent ideation? I want to advocate and encourage others who have frequent suicidal thoughts to talk about them, but I sometimes feel like a fraud for still having them. Thank you for all that you do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had a lot of clients that their baseline is passive suicidal ideation. And as a clinician, really for me, it's then assessing how does that ideation change. So yeah, I definitely have seen people coexist with it. What about you all?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think people begin, again, you start entering those protective factors. And a lot of times, again, just to talk about myself, was I started to view them as just the thoughts that they were. Yes, they were scary, and yes, that they were heavy, but to me, they started to just be thoughts. And I started to exist with them and not fight them in the reality of like, oh, I'm just gonna like, they're just gonna exist and I'm gonna be miserable. But instead, I worked with them to help navigate them.
I like that thought. Yeah, I've had a lot of not only people in my life, but clients just exist with chronic passive suicidal ideation for their whole lives, pretty much. You know what I mean? When I used to work at the VA, I worked in medical psychology, and I would work with a lot of older adults, especially obviously older veterans. And they would tell me like, yeah, I've felt this way for like 20 years and I've just felt this way forever, So yeah, I agree. Okay. Next one. Someone said, first off, love this week's topic. Anyways, can someone with suicidal thoughts not meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis? Or is there a correlation between suicidal ideation and mental health diagnoses? So this was a really interesting one. My first thought is, I'm not sure. Usually when I think of suicidal ideation, I kind of couple it with depression or PTSD and stuff like that. What do you guys think?
So I would argue that the vast majority of people that struggle with suicidal ideation probably meet criteria for mental health diagnosis. But as someone that works medical, and I think of chronic pain patients, and yes, we know like chronic pain like is highly comorbid with depression and anxiety, but and I don't actually have stats for this, at least recent stats, but I remember when I was in graduate school, so these numbers are going to be outdated. It was something like 97% of those who have completed suicide meet criteria for a mental health condition, but the other 3% are like people that have like chronic medical illnesses or may do like not do suicide. I paused for a second because that did not come out right. May make an attempt or complete suicide for religious purposes, sacrificial purposes, things like that. So I would say it is highly correlated with mental health conditions, but there probably are examples of people that don't necessarily meet full criteria for PTSD, depression. I don't know if you all have any additional thoughts.
Beautifully said. Okay, the next one. We have one fun question that we're going to include in here. Okay, so from the same person before, anonymous. We don't know who they are, but thank you. When you were a kid, or if you still eat it now, what goes first, milk or the cereal?
Cereal. Oh,
KBI, no, you're muted, and I know what you're going to say. And if you're muted, and if you're saying you put the milk first, girl, like
no, okay, no. So here's how it works. Well,
she does put the milk first, doesn't she?
She is a milk first person. I know it. I can feel it. I can sense it.
But this is how I do it, though. There's logic to it.
Okay.
So I put the milk first, and I pour little amounts of cereal at a time so it does not get soggy.
That's
so I don't
how my best friend from high school ate milk.
I don't pour
ate cereal
a whole bowl of cereal and like pour the milk, and then I pour a cup of milk, and then not even a cup, but a bowl. And I don't even pour a lot. I just eat it because I also don't drink the milk after cereal.
Oh, yeah. That's
gross.
Yeah. Okay. That was a fun question.
I like that logic though, because if you were to do it the opposite, just say you were to put a little bit of cereal and then pour a little bit of milk, then the milk is like sitting out. What do you have to go to the fridge every time I get it. Good logic there. Good. That checks out. Okay. Next question from Amanda. She's from Canada. As a paramedic, I've seen the impact of suicide on people who are left behind. I hear a lot about suicide intervention, but can you touch on what suicide postvention looks like? Amanda also went the extra mile and put hashtag Team Candy Corn 100%. So
you definitely read that.
Not.
I did not write that.
That was you.
And I wasn't a paramedic. I was an EMT. So and I did not write the candy corn.
That's the same thing.
No, they're not. Not in Jersey. No. They're different. EMTB and EMTP are different anyways.
Okay.
I think the biggest post-preventative factor is talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about, so not tiptoeing. So if my child comes home from school when he is a teenager or an adult and says, someone at my school died by suicide, I'm going to talk to him about it. I'm not going to be like, oh, okay. How are you feeling? Oh, you're not feeling good. Oh, buddy, it's going to be okay. I'm going to I'm going to talk about it. And I think that is one of the biggest post-care things that you can do.
I love that. I really love that too, because it shows that you're seeing and listening and all of that. Yeah, I'm with you.
I knew something that was helpful for me. I've shared on this podcast before that my cousin died by suicide, but I joined a survivors of suicide support group afterwards. And that was really helpful. Knowing other people went through it, I learned a lot. And then like KPI said, then we can have discussions about it, learn more about, this would be prevention as well, but like learn more about warning signs, risk factors, what to do to hopefully prevent future. But that was really helpful for me, just knowing there were people out there that understood.
I love that.
And I will say on that, for anybody who is a survivor or impacted, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention has a lot of great resources. They even have a day for survivors. A lot of maybe checking in with your local chapter and seeing if they are doing a gathering. That's a pretty common thing. Like I know our main chapter here has an event for it.
I love it. Caitlin from California, an article by Cohen et al. That suggested a suicide-specific diagnosis to help improve risk assessment and decrease reliance on self-reported ideation. Do you think it could be helpful, or is it necessary and insufficient? What are your thoughts? So Caitlin is basically saying that a certain diagnosis, do you think that is helpful for assessment and to decrease that ideation? And she directed this at Jess because Dr. Jess might be interested in this article, and it's called, quote, "A Suicide-Specific Diagnosis, the Case for," and a second title. Anyway, I'll link it in the show notes, but
no,
yeah.
Caitlin, thank you. It was
Caitlin,
so
when
funny.
I heard that beginning part, I was like, this one's for Jess.
It literally
says,
when I was
in case anyone, parentheses, Dr. Jess.
Yeah, it was so cute. I was like, Caitlin.
So Caitlin, I haven't read this article. And honestly, I have mixed feelings because I think for many people, a diagnosis or a name for something can be really helpful. And as we've already highlighted here on this podcast, not all clinicians are comfortable with assessing suicide. So I feel like if there was a suicide-specific diagnosis, it may kind of trigger something in their mind to do more thorough evaluation or assessment. I guess the other side of it is, one, it's so stigmatized. So would that help reduce the stigma, or would then people be fearful to talk about it out of not wanting to get a suicide specific diagnosis? And then my other kind of thought process argument with it, I guess this has come from a more like therapist clinician standpoint, is regardless of diagnosis, we should be assessing for suicide. And I don't think you necessarily need a suicide-specific diagnosis to talk about ideation and stuff. So I have mixed feelings, but I'll read the article and then like put something on the stories about my thoughts after reading it.
She'll loop back around.
I don't know if either. I know it was directed towards me, but if either of you have thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think I resonate with what you said about like labels, basically. You know, if there's like a diagnosis or something, it sometimes helps people make sense of it in their own minds and how they might relate to it. But I I agree. Every single person that I work with, I always assess for suicide, even if they're like, no, never had an attempt, never anything like that. And then I will actually go into detail of like, oh, have you ever thought about this or that? Or, have you ever thought about ending your life in this way? And sometimes they'll say no, most of the time. And sometimes they'll say yes, but it's very important because sometimes they'll just give a blanket no to it when really they might be struggling. So. Rebecca from Singapore. Why is there a gender paradox in suicide? For example, females having higher rates of suicidal ideation while males have higher mortality rates from suicide. And what factors do you think contribute? Rebecca, it's my understanding that, Jess, correct me, and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong here, that people who identify as male tend to have more... Sorry, my dog is howling really loud right now. It's my understanding that people who identify as male usually use more lethal means if they are going to attempt. But I'm not sure 100% if that's still accurate research. Okay, cool.
I would say, there are probably other like more minor factors, but that is absolutely the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. Another one I think about a lot, and honestly, I don't know the research on this, that this is just kind of piecing things together. Women or female identifying individuals are more likely to seek out therapy. And so they're more likely to get help or earlier intervention, where male identifying individuals are less likely to seek out therapy. So they may have been dealing with their suicidal ideation, thoughts, more, and they become more severe. So by the time they attempt, it is with more lethal means. But what the literature does say is it's the means to which individuals use that accounts for the biggest difference.
Totally. Love it. I would love to see more research about like non-binary, gender fluid, non-conforming people too. Just because we know that there's higher rates of suicide for them in general, LGBTQ population, and people who are involved in that. So, okay, next one, Megan from South Dakota. We kind of talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to bring it up. She asks, what coping mechanisms do you recommend for clients who are struggling with suicidal thoughts?
I was going to say whatever coping mechanism works for them, but then I realized that might come off the wrong way. But
I was going to say it depends. So,
a coping skill is anything that helps you and makes you feel less stressed. Now, I will say, if we're just talking about suicidal thoughts, we're not needing like crisis stabilization. One thing I find a lot with my clients, though, is their suicidal thoughts increase when they have downtime. When they're not as engaged in activity. That's why, identifying reasons for living, I do a lot of values work and things that you enjoy, behavioral activation, engaging in things, because you might still have those thoughts, but they're not as present when you're engaging in an activity you enjoy, or you're spending time with people, or you're painting or listening to music. But when you're just sitting there with your thoughts, the ideation can be a lot worse.
Yeah.
Totally. All right. Okay. Whitney from... Why am I blanking? What is MI? Is MI Michigan or Minnesota? Why did I think it was Minnesota? What is Minnesota?
MN.
Oh my God.
Right?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Whitney, Michigan. Okay. So from a counselor or therapist perspective, when you have sessions with clients and suicidal ideation is present, how do you care for yourself outside of session? Okay. And then they went on to say, or Whitney, she went on to say, how do you process the worry or fear that comes up about your client outside of session? Sorry, I missed that part. Any thoughts?
So I think for me, part of it, and I hope this doesn't come across wrong. Like as therapists, we do have to compartmentalize a lot to make sure we're not like taking on a lot of what we're talking about in session and things like that. But I will say when I have felt more worried about clients, after we've talked about suicidal ideation, suicide, made a safety plan, I am more likely to reach out to them in between sessions to check on them. I will ask for their consent to do that, to give me a peace of mind, but also to let them know, like, I promise after this 60-minute session, I'm not just like leaving you. So I've definitely done that at times, more frequent check-in, maybe increasing sessions if I have the capacity to do that. But also just reminding myself, I did my due diligence, exactly as you said, Whitney. I did what I had to do. You know, we left, especially for me working with minors. If it gets to the point I have to safety plan with a client, so it's not just passive suicidal ideation, I do bring the parent or guardian in if it is safe. There have been some rare circumstances that I won't, or we call them on the phone. So now the family's aware and things like that. And just reminding myself, I did what I had to do. A lot of times I'll cry too. Like, you know, just allow myself to have that space.
Totally.
But yeah, those are the thoughts that come to mind.
I love that you mentioned that, because we're supposed to compartmentalize and all of that stuff. And I'll be honest, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's really hard. If you have a client that you've worked with for a while, or just have a client in general who's experiencing that. But for me, what I do is I agree with everything that Jess said, of really reminding myself of what is my role. My role isn't to have a magic wand and fix everything. It's to support and guide and be there for someone and to ensure their safety to a certain point. But on the days where I find it the hardest, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but I would normally schedule time with friends if I knew it was going to be a day where I would have a bunch of clients that had a high tendency for suicide usually when I worked inpatient back in the day. And a lot of times I would just kind of let it out and cry. I tend to be a little existential, and I'm really into just thinking about like life in general and like why we're here and that whole thing. So sometimes I really do feel for clients outside of session in general, but yeah, we are trying to compartmentalize. So I don't let myself get to that point where I'm just like feeling all of it, because then you're not effective as a therapist too. And yeah, like Jess said, all the clinical stuff of increasing sessions if you need to and all that stuff. I love it. All right. Next one. Allie from Kentucky. In your own point of view, has a conversation regarding suicide changed over the past decade, either positive or negative? I think this is a great question to talk about.
No, I think it has. I think we talk more about it. I think social media plays a role in that. But I think it has. I think it definitely has shifted more towards the positive, but as always, when you start talking about it more, it brings out the people who are against it or misunderstand, whatever that word is you want to use. I can't think of the word that I want to use. It brings those people out. The people are like, why would you do that to yourself? Why, blah, blah, blah. I couldn't do that. What about your family? When we talk about it more, there's always an increase in that as well. But I do think that in the last 10 years, there has been a drastic increase in talking about it. I think there's also been that increase in the accessibility of information. And I truly do think social media is to play in that.
I agree.
I would say one of the biggest shifts I have seen, and we actually haven't talked about this, but we're all using the correct language, is the language from committed suicide to died by suicide or completed suicide. Because just to give a brief history lesson to our group members. So the term committed, like we commit crimes. We, commit is associated with criminality. And we used to say the term committed suicide because well, in some countries it is still considered a crime, which doesn't cognitively make sense to me. But it was basically criminalized and put on a criminal level. And so, going off of what KBI was saying about talking about it more and, help reducing stigma and things like that by changing the language to died by suicide or completed suicide, it takes away that criminality of it, and doesn't make it in the language sound as harsh. It still is the same thing. It's still a very, obviously difficult and sensitive topic. And, even just the subtle language shifts can make a huge impact.
Totally. Thanks for the history lesson. I love it.
You're welcome.
I love it so much.
And it doesn't surprise me that it came from Jess.
I know. I love it. I learn something every time I talk to Jess, literally. So I agree with all of that. And I think the perception of it has changed too. And I'll just bring up my work on the ambulance. A lot of my friends who were EMTs with me do listen to our podcast. So I'm going to out all of us here because I think it's important to take accountability. But when we were EMTs back in the day, I do remember the crisis calls were the calls where we felt most of the time like we don't have enough resources. Like we usually go to car accidents or, we usually go to those like multi-vehicle car accidents or like other things, people falling and really needing physical help rather than mental and emotional help. And I remember when we were going through training, there was a part in our training that says, hey, if they're experiencing a crisis or they have attempted suicide, these are the things to do. And a lot of us would just kind of feel at a loss because we didn't really know exactly how to help, because we were responding after it's happened, obviously, after somebody's called 911. And I think a lot of the people that I worked with felt this sense of like, not that it's a waste of time to respond to these things. We just didn't know how to help at the time. We were just kind of like, oh, they need a therapist or a counselor or something like that. And now it's changed so much. Like one of my best friends now, she actually responds to the crisis calls alongside police force. There's a lot more resources that people have if there is somebody who dials 911 after they've attempted, depending on the state, of course. So I've noticed that it's not only been a shift in conversation, but a shift in resources as well for people who are really responding in that way. And I also think too that people are more open, like you said, on social media. So I think it's really important. And now my friends on the EMS squad are like, I was so excited to help somebody after they've tried to attempt and they actually have a newfound sense of purpose. We talked about what it means to like live again and what they want to do. Like the conversations are different. So I do think it's changed over time too. So I agree with that. Okay. Next question. I think we kind of talked about this a little before. Taylor from Ohio. Do therapists get scared to work with clients after someone gets hospitalized for active suicidal ideation? So Taylor, I think that you're asking, do therapists get scared to work with clients after they've been hospitalized and now they're coming back to outpatient therapy? I'm just going to kind of add that in.
KBI, you're muted because I see you talking.
From someone who has hospitalized and worked with a lot of individuals who have been hospitalized, I can say that I fear more when I have unwillingly put a client in the hospital.
Me too.
And it's not fear. And it's not fear like, oh, I'm scared, like if they're going to do it again. It's fear of how has this impacted our relationship now. Because I will say I am fully comfortable talking about suicide and suicide ideation. So like, I don't really get the fear. Like, I don't get that fear of like, oh, they're going to come back and they're going to want to talk about it. No, I'm like, let's go. We're talking about it. But I can imagine that someone who isn't comfortable and one of their clients, whether it's willingly or unwillingly, I can imagine if they don't have the education in how to do that, or the training, like, yeah, absolutely, they can be scared. But I want to remind clients who are listening, that's on your therapist.
Yeah.
That's not on you as the client. That's on them they need to seek the supervision and the CEUs to learn that. And if you're a therapist listening and if you answered that question, yeah, I'd be scared, you need to go take a CEU class and a training.
Yeah.
Just.
Yeah. And ask direct questions about, like, depending on where you work, like if you work in a hospital or you work in private practice or you work inpatient, like wherever you work, the protocol might be different based on not only your state, but the place that you work at. Like if you work inpatient and somebody's saying, oh, I want to kill myself or something like that, it's like they're in a locked facility, right? So what do you do if somebody is voicing those things? Oh, when I get out, I'm going to do all these, all these things look different depending on where you work too. So I think it's important to seek supervision on those things. And even if you're fully licensed, you've been in the game for like 10, 15 years, you could still ask your colleagues, hey, what would you do in this situation? Like, what would you do? I think we have time for like one more. So let's do it. Okay. How do you deal with the shame and stigma related to suicidal thoughts? The feeling of shame I've had made it impossible to share them with anyone except my therapist. And this question came from Meg from Canada. It's a really good one. I'll be honest, as a client in therapy with my own therapist, back in the day, I felt the same way. I feel a lot of shame about like, oh my gosh, like I feel like I'm keeping this secret from like my friends and family. My therapist is the only one that knows. And if you're in therapy, that's the perfect place to discuss it. If you are feeling that shame, it's really great to talk to your therapist about, oh my gosh, if I do feel the shame, what do I do about it? I know that's not a direct answer, but shame looks so different for everybody, Meg. So.
I think it's important to kind of reflect on, why do you feel shame? Is it because of the stigma? Like, do you feel shame because suicide is such a stigmatized topic? Do you feel shame because you feel like you quote unquote like shouldn't have these thoughts? And I think identifying where the source of shame comes from could be helpful. So like if you recognize it's literally from people not understanding or people having, negative views of suicidality, suicidal ideation, that's on them. That's not on you. Yeah. Like KBI so beautifully said earlier, suicidal ideation does not discriminate. Anybody can have suicidal ideation. You are obviously not choosing to have this. It's not something that we choose. And so that was my first thought. My other thought is like, if there is any safe person, I know you said you don't feel comfortable sharing with anybody other than your therapist, but like a best friend or even like your dog, if you have a dog, and like just start like talking and practicing sharing. Because if people, even if they don't understand, they care about you and love you, they will be there to support you. And like we talked about earlier, the number one protective factor is social support. And so I'm glad you have your therapist. And I think talking about it with more people that you trust and you feel safe with will also help you reduce the shame around it. So I think that was the last question. So I guess we're wrapping up, which makes me really sad. I could talk about this for forever. Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining us for this really important discussion on suicide. And we also want to acknowledge that 8 lives that were lost in the United States and then 135 lives lost worldwide to suicide in the time that we recorded this episode. So if you are in the United States and struggling with suicidal thoughts, please dial 988, which is the National Suicide Crisis Line. If you are LGBTQ+ and are struggling with suicidal thoughts, please dial the Trevor Project's hotline at 1-866-488-786. And if you are not in the United States, we will put resources to the crisis line in the show notes. As always, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast and share this episode with someone who you think would like to hear it. And as always, we leave you with a reflection question. And this week's reflection question is, what are some of your reasons for living? So head over to our Instagram and comment on our post. We love to hear what keeps you going when you're feeling down. And we will see you next week in group therapy. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Peace.